Welcome to Life Stories, where real-life moments shape powerful lessons. Today, we bring you a story of justice, resilience, and the power of truth. What started as a routine afternoon at a gas station quickly turned into a life-changing moment when a police officer abused his authority, not realizing the man he was targeting was the chief of police himself. This gripping story will take you through fear, confrontation, and the reckoning that followed. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. It was supposed to be just another ordinary afternoon. The sun hung heavy in the Houston sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. The kind of heat that made people impatient, short-tempered. The gas station was busy, filled with the hum of car engines, the occasional honk, the sound of conversation layered over the faint hiss of fuel pumps. It was a place of fleeting moments, people stopping for gas, a cold drink, or a quick snack before moving on with their day. But for Jordan Williams, that afternoon would stretch into something far longer, something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He was only 13, still in that in-between phase of boyhood and adolescence, tall for his age, but still with the softness of youth in his face. He sat in the passenger seat of his father's black SUV, his sketchbook balanced on his lap, pencil moving in slow strokes over the page. Drawing was his escape, his way of shaping the world into something understandable, something safe. He didn't notice the police cruiser at first, nor the man who stepped out of it, boots crunching against the asphalt as he approached. Officer Jake Henderson was a man who carried his authority like a weapon. His presence demanded attention, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform perfectly pressed, his badge gleaming in the harsh sunlight. But there was something else, something more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. It wasn't just the uniform that gave him power, it was the belief that he owned the ground he walked on, that he had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. His eyes locked onto Jordan through the windshield. "Hey," his voice was sharp, cutting through the noise of the gas station. "Step out of the car." Jordan looked up, confused. His father had just gone inside to pay for gas. He hadn't done anything wrong. He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edges of his sketchbook. I'm just waiting for my dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Henderson was already at the door, yanking it open. "Out, now." The command struck him like a slap. Jordan swallowed hard and slid out of the car, clutching his sketchbook to his chest like a shield. He barely had time to process what was happening before Henderson grabbed his wrist, yanking him forward with unnecessary force. "Loitering, huh? Think you can just hang around here like you own the place?" Henderson sneered, his grip tightening. "I wasn't doing anything," Jordan said, his breath shaky. He could feel the stares now, the weight of strangers' eyes pressing in on him. "Shut your mouth." Henderson didn't wait for an answer. The slap came fast, sharp, the sound of it louder than the murmur of the busy gas station. Jordan stumbled backward, his hand flying to his cheek. For a moment, everything stopped. Conversations died, heads turned. The heat in the air suddenly felt suffocating. Jordan's eyes stung, both from the pain and the humiliation. But it wasn't just the slap that left a mark, it was the message behind it. The assumption that his presence was suspicious, that he wasn't supposed to be there. Officer Henderson loomed over him, his face twisted in self-satisfaction, in contempt. "Kids like you need to learn some respect," he muttered. The fear in Jordan's chest was drowning him. But something deeper stirred beneath it, a rage, a sense of injustice. Then, the sound of a car door closing. The crowd that had begun to form parted slightly as Eric Williams stepped forward. Eric had a presence that didn't need to be announced. He was a man who carried himself with calm confidence, his movements deliberate, his face unreadable, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He had watched the entire scene unfold from inside the gas station, had seen the way Henderson had targeted his son, the way he had used his authority like a weapon instead of a duty. And now, as he stepped forward, there was no panic, no outrage, only a silence so chilling that even Henderson hesitated. But Henderson's bravado swelled when he looked at Eric. "You got something to say?" he sneered. He still saw nothing but a black man. Unimportant, Someone to dismiss. Maybe you should teach your kid some respect before he ends up in real trouble. Eric took another step closer, his eyes never leaving Henderson's. Let him go, he said. His tone was steady, but it carried the kind of weight that made people listen. The kind of authority that didn't need a badge to enforce. Henderson laughed, shaking his head. Or what? You gonna step up? Let me guess. You think you're someone important? The air around them thickened. Eric's gaze darkened, his voice dropping an octave. Do you even know who you just put your hands on? For the first time, Henderson hesitated. The world around them was watching. Waiting. Something was shifting. The tension wasn't just between two men anymore. It was something bigger. Something that carried years of history, of struggle, of injustice. Jordan, still holding his cheek, looked up at his father. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt something other than fear. Hope. Henderson's smirk faltered, just for a second, and in that moment, everything began to unravel. For a moment, Officer Jake Henderson said nothing. The arrogance on his face flickered. Just briefly, replaced by something else, uncertainty. He had expected resistance, maybe anger, but not this quiet authority. Not the unwavering confidence of a man who wasn't afraid of him. The gas station had gone eerily silent. The onlookers, once murmuring, now stood still, phones raised, their faces tense. The world had shifted, and even Henderson could feel it. But pride was a stubborn thing. And Henderson's was inflated, the kind built on the belief that a badge made a man untouchable. He squared his shoulders, doubling down. You don't tell me what to do. He spat, his fingers still clenched around Jordan's arm. This is my scene. Eric Williams didn't flinch, didn't blink. I said, let him go. This time, his voice had sharpened. It wasn't just a command, it was a warning. Henderson let out a short, hollow laugh. Or what? You gonna fight me? Gonna try to act like you're in charge here? He yanked Jordan forward again for emphasis. You people always think you can talk your way out of trouble. The air crackled. A woman in the crowd gasped. Eric took a step forward, closing the space between them. His movements were slow, measured, like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. That's your second mistake, Eric said softly. Henderson scoffed, but there was something new behind his eyes, hesitation. Eric was calm, too calm. Jordan's pulse hammered in his ears. But he stood still, his father's presence a shield around him. Then, suddenly, Henderson shoved him. It wasn't a hard shove. Not enough to knock him over. But enough to send a message. Enough to remind everyone watching who had the power. Jordan stumbled back, his hands gripping his sketchbook so tightly his knuckles turned white. Eric caught his son's arm, steadying him, and then, he turned back to Henderson. His voice dropped lower, deadly quiet. Do you even know who you just put your hands on? Henderson froze. Something shifted in the crowd. A murmur spread. Someone whispered, wait, does he know? Eric didn't move, didn't break eye contact. But Henderson, he blinked. His fingers twitched. The doubt had set in. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the second officer on the scene, Officer Ryan Cooper, stepped forward. Jake, he said quickly, low enough that only Henderson could hear. Maybe we should. Shut up. Henderson's voice cracked, his frustration spilling over. I don't need backup. But his posture had changed. It wasn't as rigid as before. The weight of the moment was crushing him. But he still didn't know why. Eric tilted his head slightly, studying him. You're making a mistake, he said, and for the first time, Henderson believed it. Officer Jake Henderson felt the shift in the air before he understood it. It was subtle, creeping in through the murmurs of the crowd. In the way eyes widened and phones lifted a little higher. The moment was no longer just about him and the boy. It had become something bigger. Something he was losing control of. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. His grip on his belt tightened. You think you can intimidate me? He sneered. Stepping forward, his voice was louder now. Desperate to reassert authority, Eric Williams didn't move, didn't react. His calm was unshaken, unbreakable. It was the kind of calm that preceded a storm. You still don't get it. Do you? Eric's voice was low, deliberate, slicing through the tension. Henderson scoffed. What the hell are you even talking about? Eric's dark eyes locked onto his. Unwavering. And then, finally, he dropped the weight of the truth. I'm Chief Eric Williams, he said, his voice even but loaded with meaning. Houston PD. The crowd gasped. Henderson's smirk died. It happened in slow motion, the way his face drained of color. The way his body stiffened as the realization crashed into him. The man he had just assaulted, the one he had tried to humiliate, wasn't just any black man. He was his boss. Eric let the silence stretch. Let Henderson wallow in the weight of his mistake. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to say anything at all. Because the fear in Henderson's eyes said enough. Wait. Wah, Henderson stammered. His arrogance cracking apart. His gaze darted to Officer Cooper. As if searching for some kind of lifeline. But Cooper was already taking a step back. He's telling the truth, Jake, Cooper muttered. His voice wasn't mocking anymore, it was nervous. The crowd erupted into whispers. The moment had turned. Henderson opened his mouth. But nothing came out. His mind scrambled for an out. Some kind of excuse. Some way to undo what had already been done. But there was nothing. He had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. Eric took one slow step forward. His tone was measured, but the authority in it was undeniable. Now, he said, let him go. Henderson's fingers twitched, like he was physically fighting against the command. But he had no choice. His grip on Jordan's arm loosened. And then, finally, he let go. Jordan stumbled back toward his father, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Eric placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. A silent reassurance. And then, with the entire city watching, he turned back to Henderson. Now, Eric said, his voice calm but ice cold. We're going to talk about what happens next. Officer Jake Henderson stood frozen, his mind racing to find a way out. The weight of his mistake pressed against his chest like a vice. Just minutes ago, he had felt untouchable, convinced of his own power. But now, that power was crumbling. He had put his hands on the son of the Houston chief of police. The realization made his stomach twist. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were waiting. Phones recorded his every move, and he could already imagine how this video would spread. His name, his face, his career, all at risk. Still, his pride wouldn't let him surrender so easily. Look, he started, forcing himself to sound confident. But his voice cracked. This was just a misunderstanding. Eric Williams's expression didn't change. A misunderstanding? His voice was quiet, but there was something lethal underneath it. Henderson's jaw clenched. I didn't know who you were. The words hung in the air, and the crowd reacted instantly, a few gasps. Some murmured disbelief. Eric let out a slow breath. His grip on Jordan's shoulder tightened slightly, like he was grounding himself. So that's the issue, he said. Not that you put your hands on a child. Not that you abused your authority. Just that you didn't know you were doing it to the wrong person. Henderson felt a wave of heat rise up his neck. He hated that the crowd was seeing this. Hated that he wasn't in control. That's not what I meant, he muttered. Eric's voice was measured, but it cut through Henderson's defenses like a blade. It's exactly what you meant. The younger officer, Ryan Cooper, shifted beside them, looking increasingly uneasy. His eyes darted between his partner and his chief. And for the first time, he seemed to understand how bad this had gotten. Chief Williams, Cooper said hesitantly, maybe we should. Eric held up a hand, silencing him. Then he turned back to Henderson. You have a history, he said simply. Henderson's blood ran cold. Eric's words weren't a question. They weren't a guess. They were a fact. You think I don't know about you? Eric continued, his voice even, unwavering. The complaints, the excessive force reports that conveniently disappeared. The people you've humiliated, intimidated, hurt. Henderson's hands curled into fists. You can't prove anything. Eric raised an eyebrow. Can't I? And just like that, Internal Affairs arrived. A black sedan pulled into the lot, followed by another patrol car. Officers in suits stepped out, their expressions unreadable. One of them, Detective Laura Mitchell, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, walked straight toward Eric. We were told there was an incident involving one of your officers. She said. Eric nodded, his gaze never leaving Henderson. There was, he said, and I want it fully documented. Officer Jake Henderson's chest tightened as he watched the internal affairs officers step out of their vehicles. His body was tense, his mind racing. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that his badge gave him the authority to do whatever he wanted without consequences. But now, with Chief Eric Williams standing before him, with Detective Laura Mitchell from Internal Affairs approaching, and with every bystander still recording, he realized he had made a terrible mistake. He opened his mouth, scrambling for an explanation, something, anything, to save himself. Look, he started, raising his hand slightly. This is getting blown out of proportion. The kid looked suspicious. And I. Stop. Eric's voice was firm. Absolute. Henderson froze. The look in Eric's eyes was enough to shut him down. Suspicious? Eric repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. You looked at my son. A 13-year-old boy. Sitting in a car, drawing in his sketchbook. And you saw a criminal? Henderson swallowed hard. The truth sounded ridiculous when spoken out loud. I was doing my job, he said weakly. Eric's expression didn't change. No, he said. You were doing exactly what you've always done. You saw a black boy in a nice car. And you assumed he didn't belong. Henderson's mouth opened, but no words came out. Because it was true. The air around them felt heavier, thick with something undeniable. Then, Detective Mitchell stepped forward. Officer Henderson, she said smoothly, but there was a sharpness beneath her professionalism. You are under investigation for excessive force and misconduct. We'll need your badge and your weapon. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Henderson's hands shook. No, wait, he stammered. His gaze darted around, looking for support, for a way out. You can't just. We can. Mitchell interrupted. And we will. Henderson's breath was shallow. The gas station, once just another place for him to assert his dominance, now felt like a trap closing in. Jake. Officer Ryan Cooper spoke up. His voice uneasy. He stepped forward, his expression a mix of guilt and regret. Just, hand it over. For the first time, Henderson saw it. Cooper wasn't on his side anymore. None of them were. His career was crumbling right in front of him. Reluctantly, with stiff hands, he unclipped his badge and placed it into Mitchell's waiting palm. Then, slowly, he reached for his holster, removing his gun before handing it over. The finality of it was suffocating. Mitchell nodded. You'll be placed on leave pending the investigation. Eric exhaled, his grip on Jordan's shoulder steady. His son, who had once stood paralyzed in fear, was now watching his father with quiet admiration. Henderson, stripped of his authority, stood silent. He had spent his whole career thinking his badge made him powerful. But today, he learned that real power was in accountability. The gas station, once filled with the hum of idling engines and casual conversations, now held only the weight of silence. Officer Jake Henderson stood stiffly, stripped of his badge, his weapon, and his false sense of invincibility. The sun, which had once gleamed off his uniform like a mark of authority, now only highlighted the sweat on his brow, the tension in his clenched jaw. Eric Williams, still standing tall, watched him. His presence was unshaken, his hand resting lightly on his son's shoulder. Jordan Williams, the boy who had started this encounter as frightened and powerless, now stood beside his father. Watching his oppressor crumble, Detective Laura Mitchell slipped the confiscated badge and weapon into a sealed evidence bag. Her movements methodical, precise. You'll be contacted for a formal hearing, she said, her voice cool. Until then, you are relieved of duty. Henderson's lips parted, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. This isn't right, he muttered, his voice cracking. I've served this department for years. You're really going to throw me away over this? Eric exhaled, his expression unreadable. Then, with quiet authority, he spoke. You weren't thrown away, he said. You did this to yourself. The words landed hard, sinking deep into the pit of Henderson's stomach. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but what could he say? That he hadn't meant to get caught? That this was just another day of doing what he had always done. The crowd that had gathered around them didn't move. They stood rooted in place, watching as the same man who had once wielded power so recklessly was now forced to face consequences he never thought he would see. Eric turned toward Jordan, his voice softening. "You okay, son?" Jordan hesitated, still clutching his sketchbook. "I think so," he murmured, but there was something in his eyes. Something not quite settled. Eric understood. He knew that the fear, the humiliation, the anger, those things didn't just disappear overnight. But there was something else in Jordan's expression too, something new. Hope. Mitchell turned to Eric. "We'll take it from here, Chief," she said. "We'll make sure this goes through the proper channels." Eric nodded, then looked at Officer Ryan Cooper, the young officer who had once stood beside Henderson. "Cooper," Eric said evenly, "what happens next is up to you. You saw what happened here. You know what's right." Cooper swallowed, his gaze dropping briefly to the pavement. Then, finally, he nodded. "I'll write the full report," he said. "The truth." Eric gave him a long look, then nodded. Justice had started here, but it couldn't end here. As Eric led Jordan back toward their SUV, the weight of the moment still pressed heavy. But with each step away from that gas station, the world seemed a little different, a little better. And for Jordan, that was enough, for now. The events of that day at the gas station rippled far beyond that moment. Officer Jake Henderson faced an official investigation, and soon after, his termination from the force. The footage recorded by bystanders spread across social media, igniting discussions about racial bias in policing and the abuse of power. For Eric Williams, it was never about personal revenge. It was about accountability, about ensuring that no other child would have to feel the fear his son had felt that day. As chief of police, he led reforms within the department, implementing new training programs, strengthening oversight, and creating open discussions between officers and the communities they served. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had begun. For Jordan Williams, the experience left scars, but it also left him stronger. He poured his emotions into his art, using his drawings to tell stories about justice, resilience, and hope. His sketches, once filled with superheroes, began to reflect the real heroes, those who stood up against injustice, those who made the world a little better, one moment at a time. And for the community, this was more than just one confrontation at a gas station. It was a turning point, a moment that reminded them that change is possible when people refuse to stay silent. As Eric and Jordan sat together one evening, flipping through pages of Jordan's sketchbook, Eric looked at his son and said, "You never deserved what happened to you that day. But what you do with it, that's what matters now." Jordan nodded. "I want to make a difference." And he would. If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more powerful, real-life narratives that challenge, uplift, and remind us all of the strength we carry within. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.